Asterisk, this was just a warning. Next time, we won't miss asterisk. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Jason stared at the message on Elon's phone, his stomach twisting. Even after everything, the people behind this weren't done. They had been watching, waiting, and now they were making it clear. They would be back. Elon studied the screen for a moment, then calmly locked his phone and slipped it into his pocket. "They want us scared," he said. "They want us to back down." He turned to Jason, his expression steady. "But that's not how we change the world." Jason let out a shaky breath. A day ago, he had been just another kid trying to make it through the night. Now he was standing next to one of the most powerful men in the world, caught in something much bigger than himself. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel small. "What happens now?" Jason asked. Elon gave a small smile. "Now we keep moving forward." The ride back to Tesla's headquarters was quiet. Security had already locked down the building, and the intruders were in custody. But Jason knew this wasn't over. Whoever was behind this had power, connections. They wouldn't stop just because of one failed attempt. When they arrived, Elon led Jason into a private office. The room was sleek and modern, but surprisingly simple, no distractions, just a place to think. Elon sat down, motioning for Jason to do the same. "You have a choice," he said. "You can walk away. I'll make sure you're safe. No one will come after you." Jason hesitated. After everything that had happened, the thought of disappearing, going back to the streets, almost seemed easier. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He had spent too long being invisible. Now he had a chance to be something more. "I want to stay," Jason said, his voice steady. "I want to learn." Elon nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Good," he said, "because I think you're going to do great things." Jason didn't know what the future held. There were still dangers, still people who didn't want to see him succeed. But he wasn't afraid anymore. As he looked out the window at the city lights, he realized something. This wasn't just about luck or fate. It was about choices. And for the first time in his life, he had made the choice to fight for something bigger than himself. No matter what came next, he was ready. And as the plane continued its quiet journey through the night, he realized he wasn't just uncomfortable. He was afraid. The man in 14B forced a tight-lipped smile, pretending he hadn't heard the comment. But his fingers curled around his armrest, knuckles whitening. He could feel the stares now, not just from the boy, not just from the man behind him, but from others nearby. He wasn't just another passenger anymore. He was a spectacle, and he hated it. The plane hit another small patch of turbulence, a subtle but sharp shake. It wasn't enough to cause alarm, but it made his pulse quicken. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. But then the boy spoke, and what he said made the blood drain from the man's face. "You don't remember me, did you?" The words were quiet, almost casual. But there was something about the way he said them, something deliberate, that sent a cold rush down the man's spine. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at the boy. His eyes searched the young face beside him, trying to place it. He felt a flicker of familiarity, but it didn't make sense. He had never seen this kid before. At least he didn't think he had. The boy didn't press him for an answer. He just let the silence hang there, the question lingering in the air like an echo. The man behind them shifted in his seat. He hadn't spoken again, but his presence was a constant weight pressing against 14B's already fraying nerves. The more he thought about it, the more his stomach twisted. He had been so sure this was just some random flight, just another forgettable travel day. But now it felt like he had walked straight into something he wasn't prepared for. The boy took a sip of his juice, as if this was the most normal conversation in the world. "It's funny," he said after a moment. "People like you never remember." That hit harder than it should have. The man felt his face heat, embarrassment and unease mixing together. He wasn't sure what the kid meant. Was this about something specific? Or was this just some kind of vague guilt trip? Then just as he was about to snap back, the man behind them let out a low chuckle. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make 14B's throat tighten. The boy glanced over his shoulder at the man behind them, then back at 14B, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. And in that moment, something clicked. The man in 14B suddenly realized this wasn't just some kid. And the man behind him, he wasn't just another passenger. This was personal. And whatever was about to happen next, he wasn't ready for it. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. The man in 14B swallowed hard, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He needed to say something, anything, to break the unbearable tension. But before he could, the boy spoke again. "I remember you." His voice was calm, steady. "Even if you don't remember me." The man's fingers twitched. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He had spent the last few minutes trying to convince himself that this was just some strange coincidence, but now he wasn't so sure. The boy turned in his seat, fully facing him now. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking. It was something else, something that sent a deep, uneasy feeling into the pit of 14B's stomach. "You worked at Westfield Middle School," the boy said. "Right." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The man's breath caught. Westfield, his old job. A job he had left years ago. He hadn't thought about that place in ages. At least, not in any way that mattered. His mind raced. Westfield had been just another school, just another job. Sure, he had been strict. Sure, he had his opinions about certain kids, about the ones who acted like they were better than the rules. But he had never. And then it hit him. A memory. A classroom. A boy, younger than the one sitting next to him now, standing in front of the whole class, his face burning with humiliation. A boy he had accused of cheating without proof. A boy he had spoken down to, embarrassed, punished, all because he had assumed the worst about him. The same boy who was sitting next to him now. The man's throat went dry. He looked at the kid again, really looked at him, and suddenly the resemblance was unmistakable. The eyes, the determination, the quiet strength. I didn't," he started, but the words felt empty. The airplane cabin buzzed with quiet conversations and the occasional rustle of luggage being stowed away. It was just another flight, another routine trip for most passengers. But for one young black boy, it would be a flight he'd never forget. As he walked down the narrow aisle, clutching his small backpack, his eyes searched for his seat. His heart pounded a little. Flying always made him a bit nervous. But today, he had something to look forward to. He was traveling to see someone very special, someone he hadn't seen in a long time. But before he could even settle in, the trouble started. A middle-aged man, sitting in the row ahead, shot him a disapproving look. His sharp eyes narrowed as he watched the boy approach. The man's expression was filled with annoyance, and as soon as the boy paused beside his row, his impatience boiled over. "You're in the wrong seat, kid," the man snapped, barely glancing at the boy's ticket. His voice carried just enough volume for nearby passengers to turn their heads. The boy hesitated, checking his ticket again. "I think this is my seat, sir," he said quietly, his voice steady but unsure. The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Figures," he muttered under his breath. Of course they put me next to someone like you." His tone dripped with irritation, as if the very idea of sitting near the boy was an unbearable burden. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some pretended not to notice, while others exchanged awkward glances. The flight attendants were still helping passengers in the back, unaware of the tension brewing in the aisle. The boy stood there for a moment, gripping his backpack a little tighter. He could feel the weight of the man's words pressing down on him, but he refused to let them sink in. He had been taught to stay calm, to not let people like this get to him. So instead of arguing, he simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that the man didn't understand. And then, just as the man turned away with a smug expression, a deep authoritative voice spoke from behind him. "Is there a problem here?" The color drained from the man's face as he slowly twisted in his seat. His confidence wavered the moment he realized who was standing behind him. And in that instant, he knew he had made a huge mistake. The man's breath hitched as he turned, his eyes landing on the figure behind him. His smugness melted away in an instant, replaced by something else: uncertainty, maybe even fear. The voice belonged to a tall, well-built man, dressed sharply but casually. His presence alone carried an air of quiet authority, the kind that made people sit up straighter without even realizing it. His gaze was steady, unshaken, locked onto the man in the seat. He wasn't smiling, but he also wasn't angry. He didn't have to be. His presence alone was enough to shift the energy in the cabin. The boy, still clutching his backpack, glanced up at the man behind him, and for the first time since boarding, his shoulders relaxed. He knew who he was. And suddenly, everything felt a little easier to handle. The passengers around them watched in silence, pretending to be absorbed in their books or phones, but it was clear they were listening. People always paid attention when situations like this happened, but rarely did they step in. Most just hoped the moment would pass quickly. The man in the seat cleared his throat, suddenly flustered. No problem," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. He glanced at the boy, then back at the man standing over him, realizing for the first time that he might have miscalculated. But it was too late for backpedaling. The boy took a deep breath and finally slid into his seat, keeping his expression unreadable. He didn't need to say anything. He already knew the man beside him wouldn't meet his eyes again. The flight attendants were still moving about, helping passengers settle in. The hum of conversations continued, but there was a shift in the air. A quiet, lingering tension. The man who had spoken remained standing for a moment longer, as if making sure everything was settled. Then, without another word, he took his own seat, just a few rows behind. The boy leaned back, staring straight ahead, his thoughts racing. He wasn't surprised by what had happened. He'd been through moments like this before. But this time was different. This time, there was something else at play. He could feel it. And as the engines roared to life and the plane prepared for takeoff, the man beside him shifted uneasily in his seat, sneaking glances over his shoulder, because deep down, he knew he had made a mistake. A mistake that he couldn't take back. The plane steadily gained altitude, the city lights below fading into the distance. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and passengers settled in for the flight. But despite the quiet hum of the engines, there was no peace in seat 14B. The man who had spoken so harshly to the boy sat stiffly, his hands gripping the armrests. He tried to focus on something else, his phone, the in-flight magazine, anything. But his mind kept drifting back to the man sitting behind him. He hadn't looked back again, but he could feel the weight of his presence. There was something about him, something familiar, yet unsettling. The boy, meanwhile, sat calmly beside him, staring out the window. The glow of the city below had vanished into the darkness, replaced by an endless stretch of night sky. He knew the man beside him was uncomfortable. He could sense it in the way he kept shifting, how his breathing had changed. And though the boy had been quiet, there was something knowing in his silence. The flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. When one stopped at their row, the boy politely asked for a juice, his voice calm and steady. The man beside him ordered a coffee, his fingers drumming lightly against the tray table as he waited. The moment the attendant moved on, he exhaled sharply, almost like he'd been holding his breath. The boy finally turned to him. "Are you okay, sir?" His tone was polite, almost too polite. The man flinched slightly at the question. Yeah, fine." His response was clipped, rushed. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. The boy nodded and returned to his juice, but the tension between them remained thick. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. Something had shifted, something deeper. A few rows behind, the man who had spoken earlier leaned back in his chair, watching without saying a word. He wasn't the type to interfere where he wasn't needed, but in this case, he had every reason to be paying attention. Because the truth was, this flight wasn't just another coincidence. And whether the man in 14B realized it or not, he was sitting right next to someone connected to a past he'd tried to forget. The night stretched on, the plane cruising steadily, but for some passengers, the journey was only just beginning. The cabin was quiet now, the dim glow of overhead lights barely illuminating the rows of passengers lost in their own worlds. Some scrolled through their phones, others dozed off, their heads resting awkwardly against seatbacks. But in row 14, the silence felt different, heavier. The man in 14B shifted again, his nerves betraying him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he considered turning around, something stopped him. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear. Either way, he stayed facing forward, gripping his cooling cup of coffee like it was an anchor. The boy beside him remained calm, but he wasn't just sitting in silence. He was observing. He saw how the man's leg bounced slightly, how his fingers tapped against the tray table in an erratic rhythm. He recognized those signs: anxiety, uncertainty, maybe even guilt. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, causing a few overhead compartments to rattle. A flight attendant made an announcement, reassuring passengers that everything was normal, but the man barely heard it. His mind was too loud, drowning in memories he had tried to forget. Then a voice. "You seem uncomfortable." It wasn't the boy who spoke this time. It was him, the man behind them. 14B's breath hitched slightly, but he forced himself to play it off. He let out a short, humorless chuckle. "It's a long flight. I just don't sleep well on planes." His voice wasn't as steady as he wanted it to be. The man behind him didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make it unbearable. Then he finally spoke again. "Strange, you weren't this nervous when you were talking down to a kid earlier." The words hit like a punch, direct and undeniable. A few nearby passengers glanced up, sensing the shift. The air around them seemed to thicken. The man in 14B swallowed hard. He could feel the boy watching him now, waiting to see how he would respond. He forced himself to straighten up, but his hands were clammy, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been so certain, so dismissive when he first saw the boy. He had assumed things about him, spoken to him like he was nothing. But now for the first time, he was starting to wonder if he had made a mistake, one far bigger than just a rude comment. Because something was wrong. Something didn't add up. Jason turned to see a woman in her 30s, dressed in all black, wearing an earpiece. She looked like she belonged in a spy movie, but the serious look on her face told Jason this was very, very real. Elon gave a small nod, then turned to Jason. "Come with me." Jason hesitated. He was standing at a crossroads, one that could change everything. He could walk away, pretend none of this happened, go back to surviving on the streets. Or he could step into something bigger, something dangerous, and find out the truth. He took a breath. "I'm in." Elon's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. But before they could take another step, the hallway lights flickered. A second later, the entire building went dark. And Jason knew this was just the beginning. The darkness swallowed everything. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, suffocating silence. Then footsteps, fast, heavy. Jason felt his pulse hammer in his throat as the emergency lights flickered back on, casting eerie shadows along the corridor. Elon didn't hesitate. He turned to the woman in black. "How bad is it?" "Bad," she replied. "The security system was breached remotely. Someone's inside." Jason's chest tightened, asterisk inside asterisk. A distant crash echoed through the building, followed by muffled shouts. Whoever was behind this wasn't just sending messages anymore. They were here, and they weren't hiding it. Elon grabbed Jason's arm, guiding him toward a side door. "We need to move." Jason didn't argue. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to keep up as they weaved through back hallways. His mind spun. Who were these people? What did they want? If this was about him, had he just put Elon in danger? As they turned a corner, a sudden voice rang out. "That's far enough." Jason's breath caught. A man stood in the hallway, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially hidden under the brim of a cap. Behind him, two others blocked the exit. Their presence sent a clear message: there was no way out. Elon's face remained unreadable. "You don't want to do this," he said calmly. The man chuckled. "Oh, I think we do." He took a slow step forward. "You've been a problem for a long time, Elon. Meddling where you shouldn't. Trying to change things that were never meant to change." His eyes flickered toward Jason. "And now you're picking up strays. That's a new low." Jason clenched his fists, but before he could speak, Elon stepped in front of him. "Let the boy go. He has nothing to do with this." The man shook his head. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was almost amused. "This isn't about him. It's about asterisk you asterisk. The people I work for don't care about some street kid. They care about the fact that you keep proving them wrong. That you keep giving people like asterisk him asterisk a chance." His tone darkened. "That's dangerous." Jason's heart pounded. He had spent most of his life feeling invisible. Now he was standing in the middle of something he'd barely understood. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about control. Elon met the man's stare. "You think threatening me will stop anything?" The man smirked. "No, but eliminating a problem at its source." He pulled something from his pocket, a small device with a blinking red light. "That works just fine." Jason didn't need to be a genius to know what that meant. Panic surged through him. "Elon." Before he could finish, Elon moved faster than Jason thought possible. He grabbed Jason's arm and yanked him backward, just as the woman in black lunged forward. In a blur of movement, she knocked the device from the man's hand, sending it skidding across the floor. Then everything happened at once. Security burst through a side door, tackling the intruders. A struggle, shouts. The device hit a wall, sparking as it short-circuited. Jason barely had time to process what was happening before Elon pulled him toward an emergency exit. They ran. Down a flight of stairs, through another door, and suddenly they were outside, the cool night air hitting Jason's face. Elon finally stopped, catching his breath. He turned to Jason, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" Jason nodded, but his mind was racing. Who asterisk or asterisk those people? Elon exhaled. People who think the future belongs to them. People who don't want change. He looked Jason in the eye. But they're wrong. Jason swallowed hard. So, what now? Elon gave a small smile. Now, we prove them wrong. Jason felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting for something bigger. But just as relief started to settle in, Elon's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, and his expression changed. Jason frowned. What is it? Elon hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. A new message.